Hello, everyone.
Welcome back.
Welcome back. I know we weren't here last week. So nice to see you all, see your Zoom names again. I'm Sofia. I'm the Maharat intern at ASBI, and we are now progressing all the way to the book of Vayikra. We've done 2 books with our method of Parsha learning now, which is pretty exciting. As a quick refresher, we look at the Parsha. We then look at somewhere in the Gemara that quotes our passage in like sometimes an out of context way. And then we see if we can use that as a way to understand our Parsha a little bit better. So on that, we're gonna get started. Okay, I'm gonna paste the link in the chat, and also I will share my screen. If I can find my, here, 1 second. There it is, okay. And great, okay. So Parsha Vayikra, all of Sefer Vayikra, we might think this might be a little bit of a harder book to do this with, because if you are familiar with Vayikra, there is not as much narrative as the other books. So a lot of people, I think, find it quite dry, but often throughout history, the actual curriculum for learning Torah was that we started off young children with Vayikra. And there's a lot of interesting theories why. Like the probably more cynical answers that it's the most boring. So like start them off with that and slowly build up the excitement. But there also seems to be an understanding that Vayikra might seem mundane or kind of foreign to us because it's about sacrifices. But maybe the reason why we teach at a young age that there's something deeply fundamental about this book, that sacrifices, although they seem kind of archaic to us today in our modern sensibilities, this is the way that that Bnei Israel tried connecting with God. And we're trying to kind of like not necessarily need an intermediary of a prophet, but instead have their own way of communing with God by participating in the sacrifice experience. So what I think is exciting about a project like ours is we're going to try and make some of the sacrifices that we see more meaningful by seeing how they're talked about in the Gemara. And that's what we're going to do today, which I'm excited to do with all of us together. All right, so I'm going to start us off. This is for the very first part of Vayikra. So we're really getting to it, which is talking about, in general, like we're not getting so specific about the kinds of offerings just yet. And we're going to see the process in which a sacrifice is prepared. All right, I'm going to take us away with Vayikra, chapter 1, verse 1. Vayikra el Moshe v'yidaber Adonai elav me'oha moed lemor. Interesting, it doesn't say God, but we're assuming God called out to Moshe and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. If you remember from last time we spoke, the creation of the Ohel Moed is a new thing after the sin of the golden calf. God decides to reside in the tent of meeting outside of the camp, a little more distant from Israel. And now the way that Moses and God are going to convene is in that tent. So that's what's happening. Daber al bnei Yisrael v'amarta alehem Adam ki yakriv mikem korban ladonai min habehema min habakar umin hatzon takrivu et korbanchem. So we're just getting a little bit of a list of like what exactly you need in your sacrifices. Say to bnei Yisrael, say to them, anyone who is going to sacrifice to God, you can take from cattle, you can take from what are the kind of cows, from sheep. That is where you're going to be taking your sacrifices from. Im ola korbano min habakar zachar tamim yakrivenu el petach o hamoed yakriv oto lirtsono lifnei Adonai. If you want to have a korban olah, this means a sacrifice that's going totally to God. God is going to consume the entire thing. There were different kinds of korbanot. We actually talked about this a few weeks ago because we saw there were korbanot in Parshat Mishpatim. But the idea is that there's some korbanot that we also get to participate in. Think about the korban Pesach for Pesach coming up. That was something that was a sacrifice to God, but we also then that was like the Seder, right? That was what they were eating. But an olah is something that goes 100% to God. It's fully burnt. Okay, so for a fully burnt offering, you take from a cow, a male with a cow without blemish, and you sacrifice it at the opening of the tent of meeting according to the will of God. V'samach yado al rosh ha'olah v'nirtza lo lechaper alav. Now, this part I think is interesting. I don't think a lot of people know about. It wasn't just that you got a cow or any kind of cattle that you were going to sacrifice. and you brought it out. But there's a physical action you have to do, which is that you need to take your hands and lean your hands on them. So that's what's being discussed here, that you lean your hands on the head of the sacrifice. And that way atonement can happen, right? It's almost like this idea of like, if I'm the one who has sinned and I want to make sure that the sacrifice is going to compensate for those sins, that I want to somehow like take the energy, the sinful energy, and like put it on or into, it's almost magical, into the sacrifice. So that's what's happening there. ושחט את בן הבקר לפני אדוני, והקריבו בני אהרון הכהנים מן הדם. I lost my place. והקריבו בני אהרון הכהנים את הדם, וזרקו את הדם על המזבח סביב, אשר פתח אוהל מועד. So this is also like kind of messy. The Rambam talks about how actually that the tabernacle is very smelly, and we're going to see why in a minute. They would slaughter the cow in front of God or at the altar, and then the Kohanim and Aharon would come and sacrifice it. And what they would do is they would take the blood and they'd sprinkle it everywhere, all around the altar that was at the opening of the tent. So it was very gross. I think like we have this like pristine image of, I don't know what the temple or the tabernacle was, but then also like there was blood everywhere, which is kind of, one wonders what the janitorial staff of the Mishkan was like. Okay, now verse 6. So now we take the burnt offering. It's going to be flayed and cut up into sections. Okay. This also is this is a little bit more obscure, but we actually did talk about this when we were talking about the sacrifices from Parshat Mishpatim, because there's a whole question of if that knowing how to do the flaying appropriately or not was something they knew before or after Har Sinai. If you remember, that was like a very odd conversation about like things that they knew before Revelation, after Revelation, and I don't know, sacrifices don't seem to be like the top of my list that would be needed to be revealed, but okay. Okay, verse 7. V'natnu b'nei Yisrael, b'nei Aharon hakohen, eish al hamizbeach v'archu eitzim ala eish. Okay, so the children of Aaron, the Kohanim, they would put fire on the altar and they would lay out sticks like trees in order to catch fire. V'archu b'nei Aharon hakohanim et hanitachim et harosh v'et hapader al ha'itzim asher al ha'ish asher al mizbeach. So they would lay out the Bnei Aaron, they'd lay out the animal that they've flayed and cut up into pieces, and they would make it so that all the sections were laid out, and the head and then the suet, that's the pader, would be laid out on it on the wood. Vikirbo uchra'av yirchatz b'mayim v'yiktir hakohen et kol hamizbecha ola ishay reach mechoach l'Adonai. Its entrails, it's a little graphic. Its entrails and legs will be washed in water, and then they're going to turn all of that, the whole thing, into smoke on the altar, right? None of it is going to be available to us to consume afterward. That is a burnt offering. It's 100% burnt. That is what a korban olah is. And that is now something that is a pleasing odor to God. This idea of a korban, a sacrifice having like a pleasing odor, goes all the way back to Parshat Noach, where God would almost destroy the world with the flood. And then as a way of appeasing, Noach took some of the animals from the ark and sacrificed them. And then God smells it. And then God's like, oh, okay, I'm not going to destroy the world anymore, which is an interesting theological picture, I guess. But it's the same kind of imagery here. There's something that God likes about sacrifices. So before we move on to try and think, well, what exactly are we going to glean from this? I'm curious. I mean, this is an opportunity to talk about your own thoughts about sacrifices in a Jewish context, but also I think that this text in particular demystifies it a bit. Like, we hear sacrifices, we probably in our modern century, like 21st century selves, cringe a little bit. But here we have like more explicit rules about what's going on, I think in a way that's like interesting and inviting. Maybe there are parts of this process that you didn't know about before. So I'm curious if people have any thoughts, reactions, questions about this sacrificing experience based off of what we've read here. So feel free to raise your hand or unmute. Barry, how about you start us off, and then anyone's welcome to join in if they like.
Please do. I like what you said about the hands on the hands of the offerer on the head of the sacrifice. I didn't necessarily take the spin for myself when I read this stuff about the magic of it, or that is to say, the communal part of it. But I think it was for our benefit, is my spin, that by the offerer putting his hands on the head of the sacrifice, and by the way, the bull refers to oxen, right, as opposed to cows.
Yeah. Oh, yes. If cows are the female, then yes, would be the oxen, the male.
Yeah. So bullocks are oxen and whatnot. But and sacrifices have been going on since early creation, right? I mean, we have Cain and Abel sacrificing. We have, you mentioned Noah, very well put, and our forefathers have been sacrificing along the way as well, in whatever fashion. So it's been around, and I think this placing in the hands is really for our benefit, is my spin, that we want to get a feel for, we are sacrificing something that is not on the same plane as mankind, but does have some sort of life to it, living soul. I don't get into the ascent to heaven issue of I'm content with what I'm taught and learned, but there is a soul to it. There is some kind of life to it beyond the body, and I think it's for our benefit that we're doing this. It's for our relationship, and that's where I am with this. And we're carnivorous people, I guess. So we go heavy on the flocks, herds, cattle, poultry. We go heavy on this stuff. But that's where I am. I think it's for our benefit to commune with the concept of a life, and the life's blood, the blood, which is the life of that animal, being a conduit for our forgiveness. I haven't figured that out yet in my years and in my time, but there's something to it with Hashem. But this is how we keep our sanctuary periodically cleansed of our tainting it along the way. These are what we do, and we get forgiven for this.
Yeah, thank you. Right. I think that well, you're lucky that you noticed the part about the leaning of the hands, because that's actually what we're going to talk about today. We're going to go in depth about the leaning. So exciting that that's on the docket. I think that what you bring up is really important, that there's like a real psychological aspect, right? Like the power of prayer is beautiful, that we have the opportunity to like vocally invoke God to, intervene in our lives and to pray for things. Like that's beautiful. But there is also something nice about the physicality. There's something like really visceral to it, and like it can feel psychologically better. An example that I could think of is in our Amidah prayer, where we're our daily prayer, where we have the prayer of Slach Lanu, where we're asking for forgiveness. Unlike the only other action we do during the Amidah is we stand with our feet together and we bow at certain times, and the only other action we do is we clap our chests, right? So there's something there that like God knows that we're sorry, but there's something that really helps by saying Slach Lanu, Ki Chatanu, like that feels good. And we don't have to negate the psychological as like, I don't know, a crutch, or like, I think the way Maimonides often talks about these psychological things is like, ideal rationalists don't need these things. So like humans who are, a little bit more weak need them, but that's life. I think often we need things to be like physical, tangible. There's something special to that. And so if you're holding on to like the pain of sin and guilt, and you have the opportunity to like let it go, it's almost like an act of meditation where you just like kind of push it away and put it on something else. That's huge. So I think that's a really good point to bring up. So thank you. Does anyone else have anything they want to share before we move on? Okay, well, if you have anything you want to share, feel free to intervene. So since we're talking about smicha, that's where we're going to go. That's the term, the leading. I should point out, because it sounds funny, I guess, for people who might recognize the term smicha from elsewhere. Well, first of all, smicha means a blanket in modern Hebrew, right? Like that's something that leans on you, so that's cute. But also smicha is the idea of like smicha, right, of rabbinic ordination. And that actually comes from a later passage in the book of Numbers, where the way that Moshe transfers his authority onto Joshua is by leaning his hands on him in a very similar way. So it's funny because that's actually originally what smicha, rabbinic ordination, was. And so it's funny that we're talking about it here. It's like, I'm sure there's lots to be said about that's the image of teacher to student that we're passing on. That's like a positive passing on, that's passing on Torah. And I guess like leadership and authority. But it's funny because here we're talking about like a literal leaning on an animal. And they're also talking about a leaning, but it's become this metaphorical leaning of teacher to student. But we're going to talk about smicha, and specifically smicha l'nashim, which in Hebrew means, it sounds like we're talking about ordination for women. That's how you talk about it. If we're talking about like women in rabbinic authority positions, which is still a controversial topic in 2023. And I say this as a rabbinical student and as a woman. So that would be a whole great share in its own right. We were actually going to be talking about that. But what we're going to be talking about this evening is smicha l'nashim, as in women in the time of sacrifice leaning on animals. But it's just funny because if you were to take that sentence out of context, it would mean something very different. And there's a lot of like funny jokes. I mean, not so funny. I guess like to rabbinical students, we think that's very funny. Maybe to the rest of the world, it's a little bit like, okay, cute pun, but all right. But that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I'm excited because I think it's an opportunity to be thinking about women and ritual, but in a way that we're not used to because we don't really do this nowadays. So I'm excited just to show you where it goes. So we're going to look at Masechet Chagiga, the tractate Chagiga. We've seen it here before in this class. The tractate Chagiga is talking about the Chagiga offering, the offering that we give on holidays, the sacrifice we give on holidays. And in the second chapter, we have a very interesting set of debates. And here is the Mishnah. We're going to read the Gemara that expounds on it. So the Mishnah says, Yossi ben Yoezer Omer Shelo Lismoch, Yossi ben Yochanan Omer Lismoch. So this is actually interesting. If you were to like look at a list of Mishnayot, of Mishnaic text throughout the entire corpus of the Mishnah, there are always like opinions, quoted multiple opinions, but usually the format is like, here's a generic statement, often attributed to Rabbi Meir, who is a Tannaitic rabbi, but we don't actually, doesn't say his name, and they usually have like a few people who disagree. But what's very interesting about the following Mishnah is we have right away debate back and forth, and they were by chavruta pairs actually, which we'll see. So Yossi, so what are they debating? That's the question. They're saying lo lismoch, lismoch. Should we lean? Should we not lean? And what they're debating is animals were seen, or using animals was seen as a kind of muktzah on Shabbat and Yom Tov. Meaning, if you had an animal and you were going to put labor on it, if you were to see all in the rules of Shabbat, what it says, 6 days a week you work, and on the 7th you rest, you, your children, your wife, and your cattle. It says that. So they also get the opportunity to rest. It's like really nice that animals also get their day off, and also on Yom Tov too. And so what they're debating here is they're wondering if leaning on the animal is a kind of work or not. So what they're debating is if you need to give a sacrifice for the holiday and you need to lean on it in order to make it work, do you have to lean on it beforehand, like to preparatorily lean because you can't do that on the holiday? Or are you allowed to lean on it on the holiday? So that's when they're saying lo lismoch, that's their argument. When they're saying lo lismoch, they're saying no, you must lean on it before the holiday begins because it would not be allowed on Yom Tov because it's a kind of work. And then the other ones are saying, no, it's fine. It's like for the sake of sacrifice, that's fine. So that's the debate. Okay, Yoshua ben Parachia Omer Shelo Lismoch, Nitai Ha'arbali Omer Lismoch. This is yet another pair of chavruta pairs. These are called the Zugot. If you were interested in learning more about them, they appear all over the Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, and Rav Ben Yilau has an amazing book called the Chachamim. It's like a few volumes, and he provides beautiful biographies of these rabbis in particular. And so these are going through, it's actually like the generations of Zugiot. So this is starting around like a little bit after the Hasmonean, so like 100 or 200 years before the year 0 CE. And we're going through each generation of leaders. That's what's happening here, which is really cool. That doesn't always happen like so succinctly in this text. Okay, yet another pair. Yehuda ben Tavai Omer Shelo Lismoch, Shimon ben Shetach Omer Lismoch. Same kind of debate. Yes, leaning, no leaning. Now, yet another generation. Shmaya Omer Lismoch, Avtalyon Omer Shelo Lismoch. This one says that. This one says the other. Hillel and Menachem lo nechalku. Okay, that pair, Hillel and Menachem, they didn't disagree. Great. Yatsa Menachem nichnas Shammai. But then Menachem left and Shammai came in, and then you might recognize the Hillel and Shammai of our favorite debates that often appear in the Talmud. It's interesting that Hillel and Menachem like maybe weren't a good pair because they didn't disagree. Like maybe actually like that is what a good pair is, ones that like are able to sharpen each other's ideas through disagreement. So they bring in Shammai. Shammai then does disagree with Hillel. Shammai omer shelo lismoch, Hillel omer lismoch, harishonim hayu nesim, ushnim hayu avetim. So this is them saying, right, I was talking about these pairs were like the leaders of the Jewish people. Always the first set were the ones who were the Nasi, which is like the head honcho of the Jews. And the next ones were always the head of the judicial courts. So this is like a cool insight into like Jewish history, I would say, during this time. This is also the time like before the destruction of the Second Temple. So it's like, it's cool for me. I mean, I find it interesting that usually we don't see debates with this many layers of opinions that go through history like this. But ultimately, all the different names aside, what they're debating is, do we lean, do we not lean on Yatif? Okay. Here's the part where we get to where we're interested, and I'll switch to English for the sake of clarity. So this is now in the Gemara based off of that Mishnah. The Gemara raises an objection to this from a Breita. Speak to the children of Israel. The word b'nei literally means sons of, and it states nearby, and he shall place his hand on the head of the burnt offering, from which we learn that the sons of Israel place their hands, but the daughters of Israel do not place them. So we're going to do some typical Gemara logic here, where we read a verse in the Torah and we see it as limiting and not expanding, which is funny because often midrash or any kind of exegesis is like reading in something that's not necessarily obvious in the text and teaching us something new, but here we do it as obvious. What they're doing here is they're noticing at the beginning of Vayikra, where we started off, it says, Daber el b'nei Yisrael, which sounds like we're talking about everyone at b'nei Israel, all of the Israelites. But they're focusing on the b'nei, and they're saying that even though it's the male plural, and usually we read women into that, we're going to read it as just talking about the men and not talking about the women, which comes up in other places as well, like in pretty upsetting places, like the source for why women should not necessarily wear tefillin, phylacteries, is that we read the verse as talking about teaching Torah to sons, and instead of reading sons as children, we read it as sons and not daughters. There are a lot of things like this, and there's a lot of really important work being done by modern rabbis and women, and today it's kind of acknowledging like where is that coming from. But what we're seeing here now is that we're reading B'nai Israel as limiting to specifically men, and not only that, we're seeing that the leaning only happens for men. Okay. Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yishmael say it is optional for the daughters of Israel to place their hands. They may place their hands if they so choose, although they're not obligated to do so. So this is interesting, right? Like in other examples, when we read that men can do it, but not women, it makes it sound like women are actually prohibited to do the thing. But they're saying, no, they're just not obligated to it, but they could if they wanted to. Okay, let's figure out like what that means. Rabbi Yossi said, the sage Abba Elazar related to me the following incident. So we have an anecdotal story. On one occasion, we had a calf for a peace offering, and we brought it to the women's courtyard, and the women placed their hands on it. So this is now talking about the temple, not the Mishkan. Women had their own section, kind of, this is like the idea of where a mechitza or kind of gender separation, segregation comes from. There was a different area for them. So they actually brought an animal that they were going to sacrifice. They brought it to the women's section. All of the women placed their hands on it, which is actually a really beautiful image when you think about it. Like there were lots of women there, and they're like running to like scramble to put their hands on the animal. We did this not because there's an obligation of placing hands in the case of women, but in order to please the women by allowing them to sacrifice an offering in all of its particulars as men do. And the Hebrew here, which I think is beautiful, is nachat ruach. It's to provide, in a literal sense, like a calmness of the soul or the spirit, a nachat ruach. Like another time the term nachat ruach comes up is in the book of Tehillim, in the book of Psalms, when Ashrei Misha Gadal Batorah V'Amal Batorah, blessed is someone who learns Torah and toils in it. The Asa nachat ruach leyotzra. So the idea is that by doing that, you've then provided nachat ruach, this like calming of the spirit for the person's creator, i.e. God. God feels a sense of nachat ruach when we learn Torah. So I guess that's good. That's what we're doing right now. So that's one example of its usage. But here, that's the term that's being used here. So it's saying that women are not obligated to do it. They aren't prohibited to do it. So why would they do it? It makes their spirit feel better. And we'll read a little more about what that means. And I'm also curious to hear what your thoughts are going to be about it. Now, if it enters your mind that we require placing hands with all one's strength, would we perform work with consecrated offerings in order to please the women? So now we're getting to a little bit of a logistical point, right? If there's a chance that leaning really is work on Yom Tov for the animal, like, who cares? It makes the women feel better. Like, what if they lean super strongly? Like, they should not be able to do it. It's like cute that they feel better, and they feel more connected. But ultimately, if they're not obligated, why would we like risk them potentially doing something that wouldn't be allowed on Yom Tov? Placing one's hands forcefully on an animal is considered performing work on it. And if one does it without being obligated to do so, he has thereby performed work with an offering, right? Like, men should be able to do it because they have to, but women don't have to. So why would we make them do this? Rather, isn't it correct to conclude from this that we do not require placing hands with all one's strength? So this, if you remember the original debate, do we lean on Yom Tov? Do we not? This is their proof text. Women get to do it. Women are not obligated, so it must not really be work. Okay. The Gemara rejects this. Actually, I could say to you that we do require placing hands with all one's strength, but here they allowed women to place their hands by saying to them, ease your hands, don't press so forcefully, so that their hand placing should not constitute work. So no, like, you can't actually learn that because they told the women to not press so hard. So it never counted as work anyway. The Gemara retorts, if so, then the reason formulated as not because there's an obligation to place hands in the case of women is irrelevant to this law. Let him derive that permission for women to do so from the reason is that it's not considered placing hands at all. If placing hands must be performed with all one's strength, this action the women are doing does not constitute placing hands. So then they're saying, oh, well, if you're saying that really leaning on is actually how you do it, and you tell women not to do it so hard, they're not even doing it to begin with. Okay, we're almost done in light of all the all the legalism. Ravi Ami said, he stated one reason and another. One reason is that it is not considered placing hands at all, as it's not performed with all one's strength. And another reason is that they're allowed to do it in order to please the women. Nachat Ruach. So to summarize what's happening here, this original debate of can you lean on the animal or not on Shabbat or Yom Tov, does it constitute work or not, turns into this discussion of, well, let's have a test case of a time where we allow people to do it, even if they're not obligated to do so, and what happens. And that's the case of the women leaning. But what I think is happening that comes out of this, what I think is very interesting, is a few things. And then this is also where I'd love to like hear your thoughts on it, is I think this is like a really interesting microcosm for participation and inclusion in general. Is the goal, let's say with women, because this often comes up in the halachic context where women do not have the same obligations as men, is the goal to eventually get to a level of some kind of egalitarianism where women and men have the same obligations? Maybe not. I think right now in the Orthodox world, we're at the stage of women aren't obligated in all the same things, but they can do a lot of them. They can learn Torah. Torah is technically not something women are obligated in, but as you see now, women learn Torah in our community. Technically wearing tefillin or phylacteries, women don't have to do it, but they could. Is there a value to saying like, oh, you can do it, you just don't have to? Like, what does that feel like internally? And Nachat Ruach there is interesting too. Like, is there actually a real religious value to helping women feel good, comfortable? Like, since when is religion about that? So that's also interesting. I think the last piece I'd want to point out before we kind of open it up for discussion is, I think also the strength discussion is very interesting. Like, an interesting question about like weakness, strong is like, oh, assuming the women aren't going to push as strong. I think that it becomes a very interesting, I'll stick with the word microcosm, a very interesting microcosm to be thinking about what's the goal here? How do we want women or people who are in marginalized spaces to be welcomed into our space? Do we want them to have all the same kinds of obligations? And if not, what does it feel like to not be getting them? So yeah, I think there's a lot of analogs even outside of the halachic worlds. So curious if anyone wants to share. Sure, Barry, start us off.
I'm so embarrassed because I have an opinion just about everything. But, and I have one here. I think I'm feeling from the Talmudic sources here that these guys are rationalizing. I think they really think they're debating something important and pointed, but I'm bothered. I have daughters and not sons, so maybe I'm biased, and you can replace the word maybe with absolutely. But it's it's like Gulliver's Travels. It's like Blefuscu and Lilliput. Which end of the egg do you crack on? You lean on it hard, or you not lean on it hard. Is it nuach? Is it nachat ruach or not? Come on, guys. You face some serious things later on when it comes to the five daughters of Tzlafka, right? And Moshe, who missed the order for some reason or another, goes to God and gets the okay, gets the directive. Yeah.
Want to explain briefly about
these guys
are for people? What they asked for?
Tzlafka was a character in Torah, and I don't know that he was named, except for being the father of these daughters. But Rashi comments that he could have been one of two guys. He could have been a guy who did one of two things. Either one of them would put the daughters in this position, and that was one would be he was amongst the guys who, after the debacle of the spies, if you will, the congregation that went across and scouted out the land and came back with the poor report, he was one of the guys who was embarrassed about Bnei Israel, crying and rebelling against God's offer. Come in, take the land. Here you are. I'm giving it to you. And he was one of the guys who didn't take God's word for it when Moshe told the people that God said, "You're done. Don't go over. We have to now go in a different route. Turn back and go the other way." Well, Tzlafka, there were some who went over and were slaughtered because God failed to go over with them, and Tzlafka could have been one of them. Another thing was. The other thing was Tzlafka could have been one of the guys who, at the time of the manna giving, of God giving us the manna and admonishing us not to pick on Shabbos. Take your double portion on Yom Shishi and not pick on Shabbos. And Tzlafka could have been one of those guys who did go out on Shabbos and pick, and he was subject to the death penalty. So either way, Tzlafka is he's taken out of the picture. He dies. He's caused to decease, and his daughters come and complain to Moshe, "Hey, we got no brothers. We have no father, but we had a father at the time when the covenant was in place, and now we should be standing in his shoes, as if he had sons, but he doesn't. So we should be standing in those shoes." And then it came out to be, yes, Moshe, says God, yes, they should stand in his shoes. Just make sure that, I'm not sure if God directs us to Moshe, but it comes out that Moshe finally says, yes, they get the inheritance, but they have to marry within the tribe of their dad, so that the land doesn't get dispersed because of the custom of the people at the time, where a woman of any given tribe marries a man outside her tribe, that the man actually becomes the inheritance and passes on to the children through the man's people, his tribe. That's his homeland. So that's how that goes. So not to diminish the land, to carve out the land from Tzlafka's tribe to the husband's tribe of the men that the daughters would marry, got to marry within the tribe. So that was that, and so that was a tough decision to call. It was a first impression, if you will, that was happening, and so we have it there. Now it comes up later in the Torah, but the point becomes that wasn't just willy-nilly. Moshe went to God for the source, and God gave him the answer. And also, I'm taken back to Chorev and commentary I read about when Moshe was describing to the people. This comes from comment now. It's not in the text of the Torah, but Rashi comments to me that when Moshe was describing the things that they would be committing to and being responsible to meet the covenant for from the Torah. You give the hard stuff to the men, and the more civil stuff to the women. And in that case, I remember the men being described as Bnei Yisrael and the women being described as Bnei Yaakov. And I think there was a differentiation there in linguistics. And it wasn't so, it didn't describe as being Bnei Yisrael means men. It was given two different labels for the group. And actually, the circumstance seems to me, now that I think about it, to be somewhat similar to this in terms of the leaning. Let the hard stuff go to the guys, and the easier stuff, the more palatable stuff, go to the women. But the two different labels. So I'm bothered by the labels. And Bnei Yisrael is, maybe it's Yaakov fighting with whoever the angel was, whether it was Esav's guardian angel or not, but Yaakov prevailing and having wrestled with God and won, so that given the name Yisrael at that point, God is saying you're not the secretive, conniving, taker of a power of right. You earned it. You're strong. You wrestle with me. You won. You take it. So Yisrael. So maybe that's where the strength comes, but it's definitely, I think these guys are wrestling over over rationality. And I think the women I think they have a right that they should have. The fact that they're given an option and not required to do it doesn't make it less of a mitzvah if you do. That's how Barry thinks. That's all my spin.
Thank you. Yeah.
Respectfully submitted.
Thank you. I think, a few things. One, so you're pointing out the notes Tzlofchad, the daughters of Tzlofchad, I think is interesting. And I think it highlights for us, I think it's what your point was, is that we might have this idea of like, feminists, even if the term feminism, is very new, but like this idea of like helping women feel more a part of things is not necessarily a 20th or 21st century thing, all the way even in the Torah, when the daughters of Tzlofchad saw that they were not going to get land inheritance, because that was the way it worked. It was like through men, and there were only daughters, that they advocated, and then they actually got something. So like that's one, is like this idea of gender disparity doesn't necessarily have to be, it was still an ancient Near Eastern context. It's not like the whole world was a paragon of inclusion to begin with. And there were lots of other people who weren't included and treated kindly, not just the women. Like there's still slavery, like there's still lots of things. But yeah, like this idea of like, why does there have to be such a strong gender divide here? And especially when it comes to like prayer and connection to God, resonates with me. I think also what you point out is helpful, right? For people who are familiar with the Beis Yaakov movement, that comes from Beit Yaakov, from this understanding that whenever it says Beit Yaakov, it's referring to the women of the Israelites, but Bnei Israel must mean men. And that's like a nice idea, but also like we just know that's not true. Like it says that when Bnei Israel traveled in the desert, like they didn't just mean the men, like they are talking about a collective whole. I think what the issue is, it's like a little bit of a grammar problem in Hebrew, is that the male plural is used to mean a group of men and women often. And so the question is like, when does it actually mean just a male group plural, or when is it both? But yeah, so I think that's an interesting point. And I think for me, and this is where I can like share my own thoughts about it. And please, if anyone else wants to share, especially, we have women in the Zoom. I'm sure you have thoughts about how inclusion must feel for you within an Orthodox context or other. I think for me, something that I struggle with is like, it's great that we get to do things, but it's not the same as being obligated to do so. So an example of this that I think kind of illustrates the problem is Parshat Zachor. So before Purim, there's the commandment for us to hear about the destruction of Amalek, so that we don't have to commit a genocide against them. We hear the verses, and then we have now fulfilled that mitzvah. It is a mitzvah that is for men and women. And if you go to shul on Parshat Zachor, way more people show up and way more women show up. And I think that's very interesting, because women have to daven, they have to pray. But if they're not obligated to help make the minyan of 10 men or 10 people, like when you look in the morning, who comes to davening in the morning, often it's pretty empty on the women's section. So you could say, oh, women are so lazy. Oh, they have to take care of things. But like, there's something about being obligated that makes you more excited and feel more of a drive to go. And I think that that's clear in Parsha Zachor when you see all these women show up. This is like a sociological phenomenon. So I think that's what this is struggling with. And we're actually going to see this in the next source is like, it's nice to let women do things because it'll make them feel good. But that's not the same as being obligated, right? There's something nice about the psychological aspect of, like we said, like women should also get the experience of having the sin come out of them and onto the animal. And like, that's lovely, but it is the same legal status, which does have ramifications. And to me, there's something somewhat patronizing about it. Right? Like, it almost sounds like, oh, like let's let the women do that. Like, it's like a nice thing. It's almost like a pity, like, oh, we should let them have this, which is hard because I think like, I'm not sure that this is how they saw it at the time. I think at the time, like to appease the women was like a nice idea, but to appease the women sounds automatically othering. Like we got to do what the women want, as opposed to like, we are all in a community together and we should be thinking like how best to be helping all of us elevate our spiritual selves. So that's my personal kind of frustration with it.
That was great.
Oh, I want to chime in because
please,
I was seeing, as you were reading this, and I was like, it was really, really nice that they're like recognizing that the women have like this spiritual thing and that doing something really, I was thinking about when I'm praying, I'm like, feel things and how important it is, even though I'm not like obligated to certain things. And then you said something about being counted in the minyan, and I thought, yeah, like you're right. Like if you're obligated to go hear the Megillah, like you're there, you're listening, like listening and zooming it or whatever I needed to do to hear it, right? And because I was obligated, and sometimes I happen to live far out in the country, and our synagogue in Peoria always struggles to get a minyan, and I'm not counted in it, and so I'm like, for me to go, like, I'm driving at home, and so it's really, I find it really interesting, valid to say, if you're obligated to it, it's much more important to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dina. Thanks for coming. Yeah, I think it's hard because I obviously don't want to be a downer on anyone's religious experience. Like, nachat ruach, like women, like feeling good and a part of something is good. So I don't want to be the Debbie Downer to that experience, obviously. But I think that it's possible to have both those things. I know, like, I help with the women's tefillah at ASBI when I'm there, and it's like a really beautiful and empowering experience to have all women doing things. But there also is something like quite weird about it, because in a way, from a legalistic standpoint, it doesn't matter, which is like a really upsetting thing. Like, I remember there was a bat mitzvah a few weeks ago that I was helping with, and so many women came up to me and said it was such a meaningful experience. I was like, nachat ruach, nice. But then I said, but ultimately, like, we didn't daven in a minyan. And like, if someone had to say Kaddish, that would have been a problem. And like, that's sad. Like, I don't want to have to, like, it was a beautiful spiritual experience, and like, we shouldn't be negating that. But I think that there's something about feeling both of those things of like, it's good to have like empowering spaces that are spiritually meaningful. And then also, how are we going to address this other issue? And maybe we have to like have those both in tandem. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for bringing it up. Does anyone else want to share before we go to our last source? Okay, well, we'll go to the last source, and then if you want to join in, feel free. So this idea of seeing nachat ruach as playing into like larger questions of women and halacha and different ways that we can include. I think Rav Aaron Lichtenstein talks about it in an interesting way and uses it as a model. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein was the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion of the Gush. He passed away a few years ago. He was a very leading voice in the modern Orthodox world, as he was the son-in-law of Rav Soloveitchik from Yeshiva University. He was also incredibly brilliant in his own right, but that's the helpful family tree. And he actually talks about the idea of women in leadership, which is still a fraught topic, as we said, in the modern Orthodox community today, of if women can have leadership positions, can women be rabbis? And this is what he says in tradition. With respect to some limited issues currently in debate, halacha, of course, determines our standard. However, we should earnestly and honestly strive to ascertain that our halachic judgment be sound and comprehensive. In this connection, serious and responsible poskim, halachic decisors, impeccably committed and with catholicity of Torah knowledge, should, I believe, give greater weight than in recent generations has been assigned to the dispensation of la'asot nacha ruach l'nashim, cited in the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch as the basis for permitting what might otherwise have been prescribed. This is admittedly a possibly risky proposition, and one can understand the reluctance of poskim to resort to this factor. But if we want to sustain the integrity of a psak, we ought to at least give this element consideration. So what Rav Freudenstein is doing for us here is, even though sacrificing to animals and leaning on them is not relevant in our time, we should be thinking about this idea of lasot nachat ruach seriously, even in this time. What things can halacha allow, even if it's not ideal, that actually would have greater sociological benefits? So I think a real example of this would be those women's tefillah services. Okay, it's not the same as counting for 10 men, but there is something beautiful and special about it all being together and empowering to be there that way and have that spiritual experience. Even the discussion of women and learning Talmud, as much as for me it is a daily experience and it's something that is a given, it is not a given in every single Orthodox community, because of this idea of women and obligation to learn Torah, or a concern. There was a concern in the Talmud that somehow women learning Talmud would be seen as a kind of licentiousness. Again, a whole other shir in and of itself that could be connected to the times in which these statements were written. And it's also then amazing to think how far we've come in allowing women to have access to text. But what I think is really nice about it is before we get to the obligation question, I should be able to do it because it not just it makes me happy, right? That sounds kind of flippant, but it actually calms my soul. It is something that is going to give me religious satisfaction, a sense of purpose. It'll help me feel less troubled and less like I don't fit into that system. And he's saying that we need to take that more seriously, right? I was saying, it kind of sounds willy-nilly, I don't know, kind of patronizing. But he's saying no, actually taking in the emotional well-being of women when it comes to these things should be a real halachic factor. And I think it still runs into the same issues, like I said before, ultimately it's not the same as actually changing obligation, which might be a totally different conversation and probably one that Rav Lichtenstein is not in the mood to get into. He wasn't necessarily interested in a truly egalitarian future. But I think what I appreciate in the way that he's talking is recognizing that in the past, we've seen this as a concept and we should be taking it more seriously. And often I think when people think about halacha and black and whiteness of legal systems, to think that there is a built-in meta principle of taking in the spiritual and emotional well-being of those it affects, I think is very special. And so if we connect it all the way back to our Parsha, to think that this one little detail of the experience of giving a sacrifice, which seems so far away from our experience of prayer and connection to God, to find one little line that actually is telling us, is a microcosm for a great debate about what does it mean to truly be a part of a legal system. What does being obligated mean? What does religious experience mean? What are the criteria for those things? I think is very cool. And I mean, that's why I love doing this kind of Parsha class in general. I feel it takes something that seems so mundane, and then actually shows that we've created a mountain out of a molehill, for better or worse. But here I'm saying it for the better, that this little throwaway line all of a sudden becomes a world unto itself, which I think is very beautiful. And actually not just a world unto itself, but an opportunity for us to be thinking about our own orientation in the world, what we care about, maybe what we should be fighting more for. And so I think that this is another great example of that. So that's all I have to say on the subject. If anyone else wants to share, I'd love to hear, and otherwise we'll wrap up.
I'd like to share when it's appropriate turn. Everybody please go. I mean, go meeting talk.
Does anyone else want to go before Barry? Feel free to jump in.
I smell wood burning. You guys are thinking about something. Come on.
All right, go for it. And please, anyone jump in. I'm sure people have thoughts about how this might relate to their own lives and their own practice if you feel comfortable sharing. So feel free to think about it in the back of your mind now. Yeah,
I got
go for it,
three quick comments that pertain to my life.
Sure.
One is Song of the Sea. I say that every morning, and the commentary said that when we were crossing the sea and we came to the other side, and the angels weren't permitted to sing, but we were, meaning B'nai Yisrael, both. Moshe led the men, and Miriam Naviah led the women, and that was all good. First thing I think of. Also, there's a very prosy kind of thing that I say every morning in Tefillah Shachri, and that is there's a phrase Reshit Chachma. In it says Shema B'ni Musar Avicha. I'm reading in a dim light, so I'm having Avicha ve'el ve'el. Gosh, I'm blanking on it. Ve'el Titosh Torah Timecha. The point becomes, forgive my Hebrew because I'm reading in dim light and I say it much better in the morning when it's brighter. Listen to your father's instruction and listens to your mother's teaching. To me, both the same thing. I'm not going to split hairs on the Hebrew. I'm ignorant of the Hebrew, but the concepts are the same. Also beautiful, also works for me. Finally, in my own house and in I think religion, Judaism as a whole, the women were trusted to run the household. How much more respected, how much more relied upon can you get to take the infant, suckle him or her, wean him, get them to points where they can have intellects and develop them. And it takes two parents. That line from that prosy Reshit Chachma that I mentioned. It's all good, and it takes two. So we are all in this together. I'm a little bit unable to justify today philosophically why there is a difference. I am the son of my father, so I go along with what I got to that degree, and I'm getting too old to be Don Quixote and fight about it. But I have daughters, and I want them to couple and partner when they're good and ready to settle down and have a family, have a marriage and family, that they should be full partners. And I think you guys should be partners, and our parents should have been partners, and our grandchildren should be partners in our religion and in viewing and in praying to God. And it's all, the combination is all good. We got to respect you more. When I say we, I mean the current establishment has to really respect the non-establishment way more and get you back to where you were mentioning, to get to a comfort, to get to a level of comfort about being partner and not nuach, nachat ruach, but in it, skin in the game, if you will. Welcome as soon as you can get here.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that my visceral reaction to your point about like the women being in charge of the household, I think like makes sense in the ancient Near Eastern context. I think is a beautiful idea. I think that like it does feel less relevant now because I think it was used as a way to like stop, or not intentionally so, but like it just stopped women from having access and to text, to opportunities. And I don't think we live in a world like that now. But I think then your point about Torah Timecha, like that we have in a line in Tehillim, that we have, there's Musar Avicha, the wisdom of your father, and also the Torah of your mother, that you need to listen to both those things, is pretty cool. And then like a whole separate discussion, I guess there's like a gender essentialism question, like what is intrinsically different about like men and women sharing these things? Is there a difference? I think like that's a big discussion now. So I think all of that touches on that. So thank you. Audrey, hello. Would you like to share something?
Sure. Benevolent patriarchy. So I don't know, and I'll figure out how to unraise my hand at some point. I don't know if this has come up, but I guess my understanding of our lesson tonight is that in the Hebrew language, there's like a default male for groups. And that humans, is it rabbis who've interpreted that by relieving women of obligations, they're able to fulfill responsibilities and do things that they love doing in the domestic sphere. But is it clear or is it not clear that like the actual Torah does not say that women would pray?
Yeah, so this is like a great question about like how the rabbis interpreted that's not a verb, interpreted things and like where that was coming from, and also like the rabbis have biases, right? Like that's like the whole question about Torah Shebaal Peh in general, like when it's being interpreted in partnership with God. That also means that we're dealing with humans who are fallible and like are subjected to their own social influences. So your question about like, did women pray? It's not explicit in the text from a literary standpoint that it's talking to just men. I think we had those times like Israel versus Beit Yaakov, but it's not clarified here. There are some women that pray, but it's like explicitly like Hannah in the first book of Shmuel would be an example of that. And I think what's cool about it is like, it's pretty rare that women pray, but she actually becomes the paradigm for kavanah, for intention. So in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, in the tractate Rosh Hashanah, they use her as, and in Brachot as well, they use her as like the source for learning how to have intention in general, like whether you be a man or a woman. So I think that's cool. Like it's one example of a woman, and it's pretty rare, but then all of a sudden she becomes the way that everyone is like supposed to see their davening experience. To your other point, Audrey, I was going to tell a funny story about language, and then unless anyone else has anything else to share, I'll make sure we wrap up because I know we're a bit over time. But in the seminary that I went to in Jerusalem was all women. And we spoke in Hebrew. So the way we were addressed was in the feminine plural, which is the masculine plural. And then my grandparents came to visit. So there was one man my grandfather in the class and a bunch of women. And technically, if we're looking at like Hebrew grammar rules, we should have started switching to the male plural. And then my teacher, Rav Shmuel Klitzner, who's lovely, I believe his wife has spoken at ASBI before, Judy Klitzner. We've had her on a story sheet before. She's great. So he actually said, he turned to my grandfather and he said, "I'm so sorry. I know you're in the class and that's amazing, but I'm actually going to continue addressing everyone in the feminine plural, if that's okay with you," which was very sweet. My grandfather obviously did not care. He thought it was very sweet, but like I thought that was like an interesting awareness of like the built-in patriarchy into the language, and yet still finding a way to transcend it even in the moment, which I thought was quite nice.
Why not use both, like ladies and gentlemen, or gentlemen and ladies? Why not do both?
Yeah, that's a good point. Like there also is a movement in Israel where they're beginning to try and like combine them, like built into like for bruchim habaim, right? Like welcome. They have the mem Sofia, which is a block that they also like turned it into like a taf. So it could be like bruchim or bruchot, depending on how you read it. I don't know how much it's catching on, but like there's a group of people who are like, we need to try and make the language in and of itself like be able to be read in either direction. So that'd be interesting to see how much that catches on. But yeah, I think that these are all like touching on larger questions of like, how does one think about how change should be happening to these systems, how embedded into these systems are like certain levels of inclusion or not. So I think this all kind of, touches on that. I
got two earlier women for you, Sarah and Rivka.
Very
Sarah,
nice.
when she came up against Abraham at the weaning of Yaakov, of Yitzchak, and Sarah says, and that maid and her son out, and Abraham was vexed. God says, listen to her voice, meaning she speaks wisely. That's my order. And I got to believe, I don't need a Torah to tell me in words. I got to believe that the implicitness is she prayed for that. She wanted that to happen. She prayed to God for it. The other thing was Rivka at the corners of the house when Yitzchak and she were both praying for having children, and Yitzchak's prayer was granted, according to Rashi commentary, for a very pedigree royalty kind of concept, that the guy who comes from righteousness of more generations gets heard before the person who comes through righteousness of lesser of number of generations. So Rivka was a righteous person from her time. Yitzchak was the second generation of righteousness, so his prayer got heard according to Rashi commentary. But I got to believe if Yitzchak wasn't in the room, that Rivka would have been given due ear of God, that righteousness. So keep praying, gosh.
Amazing, thank you. Okay, on that note, since we're over time, I'm gonna wrap us up. If you ever want to continue to talk about any of these things, you're welcome to reach me at my email. I think it was on the doc. If not, I will put it in right now so you have it. And yeah, thank you so much for spending your Wednesday evening talking about these topics. I think that they're really important. I think that aside from it being like a fun exercise, how to think about the Parsha, I think they often bring up like really interesting ideas of how we navigate ourselves in the world. So thank you for your participation, for your presence, and hopefully see you next week or another time. Take care.
Good luck, everybody. Great class.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Sophie.
Take care,
Amazing.
everybody.
Have a good night.
Take care. Good night.